tends to make degrowth arguments, or we have enough and now we should constrain resources arguments, they always seem to start with a viewpoint that we've gotten to a sufficient level of technology and civilization, and that we now have abundance, and now we can hit the pause button and start conserving the resources. But I think that assumption is obviously false, but I think there's a visual and evocative way to start proving that, which we don't currently do. And that is, I think it would be great to figure out what applications are stupendous and seem almost like sci-fi, but are absolutely possible under the current physics, but they just require a lot more energy. Like, for example, if we had, let's say, if the cost of energy and the ability to deliver power was 1,000x what it is today, and the cost of all energy was 1,000, what could we enable that would be brand new, but just using the existing physics and the existing know-how? So, for example, does that mean that we could have superconductivity working, or we could have some sort of, I know anti-gravity doesn't work, but something along the lines of that would allow us to be flying creatures or what have you. So I think it would be interesting just to look at the current literature, figure out what is possible, but just requires much, much, much larger amounts of cheap energy delivered at high power, into a single concentrated place, and then say, hey, look, if we had energy abundance through fission or fusion and new technologies around the energy side, then we would unlock this knowledge that we already have into practical applications. And that I think would help nip the degrowth argument in the bud. It would also help if the whatever we were able to develop was very visual and very evocative, as opposed to just sort of theoretical and background based. Anyway, hope this makes sense.
Of course, with the caveat, the growth of knowledge is inherently unpredictable, and the truly major world-changing tech is just not foreseeable before it's invented. The biggest upside I see for cheap, ubiquitous energy, which is absolutely possible, is providing the conditions where people begin to do, for example, some of the huge infrastructure projects we sometimes hear about, but which also always seem like they're decades away. But none of them will happen by private industry, really, until the energy and other resources are cheaper. And they absolutely could be cheaper. I don't know much about the global situation, but I know in Australia, which is resource rich, it's not much of an exaggeration to say our wealth in Australia really is just dug out of the ground in large part. That even here, the mining companies, whether they're mining energy directly in the form of coal and uranium or other minerals like aluminium and iron, even they cannot grow as they should be able to because of government regulation to do with environmental concerns or just straightforward prohibitions on building more coal mines. And add to all of this the extremely high taxes on all of the resource industries, which act to drive down any motivation for these companies to stick their neck out and do the exploration in investing in new risky projects. Okay, so imagine a world where regulations are reduced, taxation is severely diminished. You have a world where the potential of those resource industries is unleashed, and therefore a reduction in costs and a more ubiquitous supply of all of these things to everyone who wants them. What then? Well, not only do you get cheap energy, but of course, all your resources follow in lockstep in decreased costs. Well, your manufacturing falls as well in decreased costs. Consider coking coal, that's a form of energy, the coal used to fuel the smelters that allow you to produce the aluminium or the iron. When the cost of that falls, so does the cost of the metals. So you've got this cycle of decreased costs. And if you have now cheap energy, you've got all the cheaper building blocks for everything else. In that world, would we have far more space startups than we do now? For the moment, it's the plaything of billionaires. Could millionaires afford to begin experimenting with rockets that carry passengers? Could we have space lines competing as airlines do today in just a couple of decades? Could we have floating cities? Look at what is already done with cheap energy, or was until recently anyways, in places like Dubai. Cheap energy with, I imagine, somewhat more lax concerns about the environmental impact. Just take back the ocean itself in some places and make it habitable. Elon's Hyperloop idea. Could more cities be hooked up with high-speed, underground, super-safe hypersonic trains? Certainly worth looking into what has already been proposed, but for want of cheap energy and resources, it's just not happening yet. Of course, the real answer also is that we just don't know what, for example, kids in homes struggling to pay bills might accomplish in a situation where their health and wealth isn't always so precarious because of government policies artificially inflating the cost and scarcity of resources. But I'm back to the theoretical. So here's a practical one. The space elevator. At the moment, it's something like $10,000 US per kilogram to get something into space, into orbit. But if you've got a strong enough cable that's long enough, tethered one end to the Earth and one end to an object in geosynchronous orbit, then you drop that cost by about 1,000 times. Who knows what follows from something like that? More space elevators? If it becomes trivial to get 35,000 kilometers away from the surface of the Earth, does the Earth itself suddenly become ringed by cities in space exactly like the sci-fi writers imagined? Maybe.
I love these thought exercises. I always think about them, especially with regards to energy and, related to what you were saying, regardless of cost of energy, imagine you could get energy into an incredibly small space. A AA battery has the power of a nuclear power plant. What could you make then? With the existing understanding of material science and things like that, you could have rocket shoes. We can build rocket shoes, we can engineer them. You just can't get energy into a small, light enough space to make rocket shoes viable.
Okay, so this is a really good one, actually. The space elevator has actually come up in a bunch of science fiction. Cixin Liu's three-body problem makes it a cornerstone. So that's really interesting because I'd combine it also with Bezos's comment that, long-term he sees Earth as sort of the residential area and orbit as the industrial zoned area. So if a space elevator made things cheaper by 1,000-fold to get into space, and then more heavy resource consumption manufacturing could get done in outer space, where solar, for instance, would presumably be a lot more generous, both in terms of capture and power. That does start to look like a beneficent world of the future and abundance.
Yeah, combining these two observations, perhaps it even would satisfy the environmentalists or the true environmentalist crowd that, hey, if we could build nuclear fission and fusion properly, we could power space elevators. Space elevators would get all the polluting industry off Earth, and then all polluting industry could be done in space, where it belongs. But somehow I think the degrowth crowd just wants us to stop growing. They don't really care about pollution deep down, but perhaps that's too cynical of a view.
I think you are correct. These guys are not looking for solutions because solutions are well known for decades, and all the solutions depend exactly on that cheap, abundant power that only nuclear can provide. And for example, for carbon capture, that's actually easiest problem to solve from standpoint of basic physics, because how you capture CO2? Well, you get dry ice. What is dry ice? It's basically a hard brick that is heavier than water, and the kicker is the bigger the pressure is, the more stable that brick is. In other words, your easiest form of disposing of CO2 bricks of dry ice is actually sink them to ocean floor. The reactivity with water is minimal. Under pressure, they stay solid. And that's it, just provide this offshore station with high amount of energy, and industrial process to create dry size brick is actually trivial. It's just condensation and liquefaction. So there is no chemicals are involved. It's absolutely 17th century vacuum mechanics. That's all that required, plus energy. So in other words, if these guys really wanted climate change solutions, we already could have been running a network of hundreds of these offshore platforms that capture industrial quantities of carbon and just sink them to ocean floors, but that require embracing nuclear energy. And yet again, if these guys would be looking for solutions, they embraced that very long time ago.